Hello and welcome to BeerCraft, Colorado's craft beer show. We're coming at you live from Studio Kitchen, Colorado, home of the Modern Eater Network. I'm Andrew Moore with Intrepid Sojourner Beer Project, and here with me is Jeff Tyler, head brewer and owner at Spice Trade Brewing in Arvada. And we are bringing you a brand new show. This is our very first episode. We're very excited to be bringing BeerCraft to you. So again, you can check us out live on Facebook if you're within the sound of my voice right now on the Modern Eater Facebook page. BeerCraft is a show that looks at culture, history, and the industry through the lens of beer. Yep. Right? So our goal is to look at not just what happens once that pint of beer gets on the counter or in the consumer's hand, but everything that goes into that pint of beer. And I keep wanting to use the word holistic, even though it's not what I mean, but like a holistic approach to everything that goes in that beer glass.
Yeah, it's going to be a deeper dive on craft beer than just news items, who's brewing what the trends are. We'll touch on that stuff too, but we really want to get in the weeds with fellow brewers, get technical about brewing science, but really expand it outside of beer. We do a lot of adjunct-heavy beers, a lot of beers that involve other ingredients that are not your traditional barley, hops, water, yeast. And so we want to talk to the providers of those items because they're artisans in their own respect, and they're doing a lot of really cool stuff before those products even get onto the table. So we're talking about coffee producers, we're talking about chocolatiers, we're talking about spice importers, we're talking about people who source exotic fruits, all sorts of people that are doing really cool work and really allowing us as brewers to display those ingredients, sort of like how chefs will display ingredients when they're putting together a plate.
Yeah. So before we get too far into what the show is going to look like, a little bit about I suppose who we are and why are we telling you about craft beer. So I'm the head brewer and one of the owners at Intrepid Sojourner Beer Project down on 8th and Santa Fe in Denver, the Arts District in Santa Fe. We've been open almost 2 years. We'll be celebrating our 2-year anniversary in May. And we brew a lot of sort of internationally inspired beers that look at cuisines, that often look at cuisines kind of all over the world. So my background into beer had nothing to do with beer. It was classical archaeology, but it was a lot of brewing with ingredients from that part of the world. So basil, Turkish coffee, garlic, apricots, all kinds of fun flavors, and then opening that up to influence from the rest of the world with Intrepid Sojourner, because I don't know what an Eastern Mediterranean brewery looks like.
It might look partially like Intrepid Sojourner Beer Project.
Partially.
I'm still waiting for that garlic amber to come back.
It's coming back March 1st.
March 1st, mark your calendars. Garlic beer. We'll be back in Denver.
Yeah.
Nice. A little background on me. I'm Jeff Tyler. I'm the head brewer and one of the owners at Spice Trade Brewery. We're a small brewery in Old Town Arvada, formerly Yak and Yeti Brew Pub. So we've been there as Yak and Yeti Brew Pub coming up on 11 years now. Spice Trade is about 2 years old. So after I came on, we kind of refocused the brewing style a little bit. So I always tell people that Spice Trade brews unique beer styles inspired by culinary ingredients from all over the world. So very similar brewing style to Andrew. We really try to focus on a region and a flavor profile and sort of view beer as kind of a culinary experience. Now, that's not saying we don't brew traditional styles of beer. We definitely do, and I enjoy personally traditional styles of beer, but we always try to put some twist on it and showcase some region or some ingredient to kind of help put a little more depth into it, sort of more like a chef designs a dish than kind of a traditional German brewer makes a Pilsner. So that's a little bit about Spice Trade. My background also was mechanical engineering, which morphed into home brewing, which morphed into brewing too much of my spare time. And I was like, I should probably just do this for my full-time job so I don't have to spend all my full-time and part-time doing it. So yeah, that's a little bit of background on me. And I'm really excited to kind of kick this show off. This is our first episode. And the format of the show is essentially going to be a weekly show. You can catch it live here every Wednesday. Or it's also going to be archived on YouTube, on our Facebook pages, and we'll have a podcast audio stream that you can listen to if our live streaming time doesn't work out for you.
Yeah, so normally we'll be on Wednesdays at 2:30.
Yep.
So if you'd rather watch us than whatever it is you're supposed to be doing Wednesday at 2:30, Going forward will be Wednesday at 2:30. We had so much content, so many cool guests, and we had so much we wanted to say about Stout that you're getting 2 full hours of Andrew and Jeff.
Yes, it's going to be great. Buckle up. We're talking about Stout. So February, our topic, basically every month we're going to have a topic. This month's topic is Stout. And each week we'll have a different subtopic of Stout to talk about and different guests that kind of tie into that subtopic. So Stout is a great topic to start off the show with. It's February here in Colorado. It happens to be sunny out today, but it snows a lot of the time in February, and it's a great kind of, there's some misconceptions about it, but in general, it's kind of a bit fuller-bodied beer style that is enjoyed during the winter months, more so than maybe a hot summer day.
Yeah, it's definitely, my favorite style of beer depends on the season, but as we get into like winter and mid-December and into February, it's definitely one of my favorite styles of beer. And Stout Month, which takes place at the Mountain Sun locations in Boulder and Denver, was one of the things that helped push me into craft beer. Right?
Yeah.
I came out to CU Boulder, was going to school there, got my master's degree through the Mountain Sun, and it was a great place, great stouts.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to kind of kick this month off with Stout as kind of an homage to that influence.
Yeah, they're doing great stuff. When I first moved out here, I was blown away that there was a whole month dedicated to Stout. I was like, what is going on in this awesome state? This is fantastic. And the guys at Mountain Sun do a good job. There are a couple other breweries around the U.S. That do this too. Fort George Brewery out of Astoria, Oregon is another brewery that February is their Stout month. They haven't quite been doing it as long as Mountain Sun has, but it's just interesting to see a couple different breweries around really incorporating stouts into the winter time. And Mountain Sun's been doing it for 26 years now.
Wow.
And it's still going strong. They have their own stouts. They have a lot of fun flavors that they put into the stouts. They have guest stouts from breweries all over the state. And I think one out-of-state brewery, I think Dragon's Milk, is on there this year.
Oh, nice.
But yeah, really cool place to start the show. And stout's actually a really good beer to look at when we're talking about beer history, because a lot of modern advances in beer serving technology lead back to the stout, and it's a good example of kind of innovation in beer styles, which is something we're seeing today. And so it's a good jumping off point to kind of dig into beer styles versus innovations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this hour is all going to be how did we get here, right? How did Stout come about? And
I like that.
Yeah, yeah, it's alliterative.
Yeah.
And we've got a couple of guests with us today to help us dive into the history of Stout and malting. Who's here?
So we have two awesome guests with us today. Jake Gardner of Westbound and Down Brewing in Idaho Springs is here. He's the head brewer there. He's going to join us to talk about stouts and all sorts of fun stuff. And I'm looking forward to kind of chatting with him, especially about kind of some of the history of serving of stouts and kind of traditional stout varieties versus a little bit more of a modern approach to brewing stout. So excited to have him on the show with us today.
Yeah, and then we've got Dan Galvagni from Root Shoot Malting.
Yep.
Some exciting things going on at Root Shoot Malting we'll get into a little bit, as well as the history of malt and how that led into the stout that we're drinking right now.
Yeah, and malt, raw ingredients have a big impact in the history of beer, and so it'll be fun to kind of dig into that a little bit and figure out how stout became what it is based on the ingredients that were available and some innovations in brewing ingredients that happened at the time.
Yeah, great.
Yep.
So again, this is BeerCraft, Colorado's craft beer show. We're coming from Studio Kitchen, Colorado, which is the home of the Modern Eater Network, and we're talking about the history of stout.
Yeah.
And so I kind of want to pick Jake's brain.
Yeah.
Because I feel like he's going to be able to help us fill in. So stout, should
we get a little intro from Jake?
Yeah. So
let's get a little intro from Jake. Get maybe some of your background, some of your history. And just kind of bring everyone up to speed on where you brewed and what kind of beer you enjoy brewing and what you're working on now.
Cool. Yeah, I'm Jake Gardner, as they said. I've worked in the industry since 2011. Started at Breckenridge Brewery right out of college. Kind of worked the whole gamut of positions there. Moved on to Hogshead Brewery, which I think is pretty well known for their cask condition beer, as well as their dark beer, porter and stout. especially their porter, which, as I think we're going to get into, is intimately connected to the history of stout. Maybe is actually just the same history as stout. Then 3 years ago in December, while still at Hogshead, with 3 other owners, we opened Westbound and Down. For a while I was doing both, and then as that got kind of overwhelming and as both grew, I've been just with Westbound and Down for the last 15 months, 16 months. So
Gotcha.
That's kind of my history. Know a decent amount about, as you mentioned, the traditional dispense of porter and stout.
Yeah. Awesome. Nice. That's great. Let's. Do you want to kick off a little bit about kind of where I think both of you guys would be great to talk about, but how stout came about, maybe what the precursor beer style to stout was?
Yeah, so as Jake mentioned, I mean, you have stout and porter, and I feel like often when I talk about them, I switch them back and forth because they're sort of the same, 2 branches on the same tree of beer. As malt technology progresses and as sort of flavor preferences progress, right? So you have a beer that is porter, right? And there are a couple different thoughts about the history of porter. Again, you know, some of this is a little bit of folklore, some of it's a little bit of mythology, some of it's a bit of scholarship. But I think the common understanding is that porter, right, was a slightly darker beer. Maybe it's a low in ABV, slightly smoky because of the malt technology, and it was primarily a beer that was consumed by the working class of the United Kingdom. Right, often often a beer consumed in place of lunch, so porters, miners come up for lunch, come up from the mine for lunch, drink 2 porters, get your sharp tools, go back down in the mine, and keep working. So it was a.
Do you guys still do that in Idaho Springs?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Every day.
Every day.
At least the 2 beers at lunch part.
There's a little gold left there, huh? No, maybe, probably not.
If so, I'm unaware.
Yeah. And so part of it is this kind of almost like nutritional supplement, like this inexpensive way of getting nutrients, of getting calories at a historical time when water is not always reliable. And then part of it comes out of like a tradition of the bartenders and their casks and serving and blending casks, right? So we've got it takes a lot of effort, right, to pour a good beer out of a cask in a British pub in the 17 and 1800s. And so the result was often some blending that would go on to like make sure the flavor profile was all right, make sure the headstand was what people expected.
Yeah, let's expand on that a little bit as far as serving from a cask and just making cask beer. Maybe not everyone listening knows what cask beer is. Do you want to kind of run through the basics of what cask beer is?
Yeah, I'm a little rusty from the spiel I could rattle off some 15 months ago, but effectively cask conditioned ale is ale that is served with no extraneous CO2, and the CO2 in solution is from a fermentation created in the vessel from which it is served. Right. So there's kind of 2 methodologies of that. I like to think of them as kind of the London way versus the West Yorkshire way, but effectively either a mature, fully fermented beer is put in a firkin with some sort of priming sugar, potentially fresh yeast. Also, this spurs a second fermentation in the vessel. It's bunged, closed, creates carbonation. The vessel is broached and poured on cask. The other way is the first fermentation is captured at roughly quarter gravity into a firkin, allowed to complete its fermentation, if done well in a room, temperature-controlled room, and then that end of that initial fermentation causes the carbonation that you drink, and then it is served simply by a beer engine, which is simply a piston that pulled down draws beer out of the firkin and pushed up and then pulled down dispenses it through the swan neck into the glass. So I think a lot of the blending, it's kind of an interesting history of porter because a lot of it was out of necessity. This was made to be a working class beer initially and for the masses, as beer often has been. And so none of this kind of nonsense ever goes on at Hogshead, but a lot of the blending was actually, a way to take firkins that were past their prime, not finished, but still be able to artistically blend them into something and make something that, at best was not bad, and or at worst was not bad, and at best was better than the sum of its parts.
Right, and this was a time before modern refrigeration. It was a time before industrialized gases were available for serving beer.
When you're utilizing that beer pump, right, through the natural carbonation, I mean, you're drawing oxygen into that environment.
Into the vessel.
Into the vessel as you're dispensing the beer. Right. So it's going to oxidize. It's going to get papery, cardboardy, all of those flavors. And so that's that need to blend, right, in order to make palatable brews.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
Depending on the gravity of the beer or on alcohol, these beers might be good fresh, like we assume draft beer is for between 2 and 7 days. Depending if we're talking about a 4% beer or 8% beer. So not a long time.
Yeah. So people don't, I think, maybe in the modern day, people don't think about beer as a perishable product as much as a brewer would think about beer as a perishable product. But beer is a perishable product. It's a live product. It ages. It has its prime, and it kind of degrades from there. And sometimes I think we should all be super excited that we have modern refrigeration and carbon dioxide and inert gases readily available so that we have that long window that we can enjoy beer, because it wasn't always like that. It was a much shorter window, like you're talking about, to enjoy that product. Yeah.
So and another, I suppose, piece of the stout that we should talk about, and because then I want to get over to some of the malts, is that initially, right, stout came along as a designation that just meant that a particular beer was strong. The ABV was higher than normal. So you could have a stout English pale ale, you could have a stout porter, you could have an extra stout porter, you could have a stout amber. It was almost like a 18th century stand-in for imperial.
Imperial, right.
It just meant what the term actually means,
like
burly and strong.
Burly and strong.
Right.
But then a lot of those, because of the the increased amount of malt in there in some of those beers, and then also because of some of the blending, right? The porters were typically also a little bit darker than a lot of the pale ales and other English beers that were being consumed at the time.
Right.
And then with malt, as malt technology changed, we started being able to produce some things that were a little bit darker,
right,
and contributed to other things than just like starch and enzymes.
So porters they started this new subcategory of porters called stout porters, which were a higher ABV or fuller bodied porter, and that kind of grew in popularity as a style until this little known brewery called Guinness decided to pick up that style and make a stout porter. And one of the key changes that they made when they made their stout porter was they started using black patent malt, right? Black patent malt was roasted to a much higher degree than any other malt previously. So porters typically were made with a lot of brown malt, right, to kind of give that darker color. And then the advent of malting or the advent of black patent malt in the malting process kind of helped spearhead at least Guinness's definition of what became the original stout. Originally, it was Guinness's stout porter, and then they kind of dropped the porter, and they were like, "This is Guinness stout. It's made with black patent malt."
Yeah.
So I'd love to get a little background. We can bring in Dan to chat about malt a little bit from Root Shoot Malting, on kind of the history of that, and maybe talk a little bit about how malt is roasted. We have some malt in front of us to give people kind of a baseline of what malt is, and I think Jay has a picture of that he can throw up on the video feed for us to look at. But do you want to walk us through what malt is and how it impacts beer?
And first, can you just maybe introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Root Shoot Malting?
Sure. Yeah. Dan Galvagni with Root Shoot Malting. We're out of Loveland, Colorado. Small family farm that were barley growers for Coors for about 40 years, and decided to kind of take the next evolution in what is the family farm, being that it's, a small to medium size and not super large, and invested into a small compact malt house, and now are growing a few varieties of two-row that we keep in-house, and we essentially have a German-style malt house made by Kasper Schultz out of Bamberg, Germany, in-house, and we produce about 20,000 pounds a week through the process. For us, we have a kiln, so a lot of the lighter Lovabond style of base malts, crystals, things of that nature is what we specialize in. And the history of malting is, really corresponds a lot with the history of beer. Talking about what styles of beers were available, refrigeration, things like that, spoilage and what have you. Back when kilns weren't as sophisticated as they are today, where you can get precision accuracy in your fire and your temperature, malts were smoky because a lot of times it was coal or it was straw that was firing the hot box.
In England, a lot of times wood.
And wood?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The brown malt era was.
So that's it. Yeah. No, that's it.
So that color came from the smoke, essentially, during the malting process?
Essentially, the control of the fire. Like, there's no fire below our malt. It's all hot air. Coors uses steam. There's a lot of different varieties. And even your your modern floor malting malt houses like Crisp being a big one in England, they have multiple layers where they're moving their grain through steeping, germination, and then about a 70-hour kilning process. So really light temperatures. And because of that, you even, doesn't matter if you're English or in Germany, you had a lot more darker beers because controlling your temperature and your killing process just gave you a higher color. And so you had, porters were traditionally brown malt beers, and they were less expensive to produce. They did, even though spoilage was quite common, they did last longer than a lighter beer or what have you. And then just the black patent malt that came around in, I think, 1817 was Daniel Wheeler, and it was an actual patent, and that's why they called it patent malt. So 200 Celsius or 392 Fahrenheit, whatever. So you could, obviously that malt didn't have any enzymes, but mixing that with more traditional or evolved kilning practices gave you high enzymatics that you could use as a base malt, and then bringing in this coursed roasted malt obviously gives you a good balance with the stouts.
Yeah.
I think that also worth mentioning outside of malting invention, I think it's 1780, it's around there, is the hydrometer. Before that, there was all kinds of nonsense of people like putting their thumbs and seeing how sticky it was, and people sitting on puddles of beer and seeing if a fat man stuck to it, and they tax you based on that. I'm not kidding. There's ridiculous history to look up.
It's like the history of horsepower. It was just like the horse's power to move a carriage.
But there was, in that brown malt era, not that there was no one that was lightly kilning malt, but it took a lot longer, as you mentioned. Yeah. And there was no proof that it was any better or more efficient. And then a hydrometer was invented, and people were realizing, all right, these maltsters are charging a ton more for this pale ale malt than they are this brown malt, but it's actually so much more efficient in producing sugar to convert into alcohol that it's actually cheaper to make beer with the more expensive pale ale malt. And before that, so that kind of coincided with the cylindrical drum roaster 1817 deal, because otherwise no one would have cared. It was like, well, we don't want black malt.
Right.
But, just 35 years before that or whatever, people had realized, hey, it's cheaper to make pale malt. But then they needed an answer to how do we make porter, because porter was the rage in that era. Right. It's like, okay, cool, we can make beer cheap with pale malt, but we're not trying, we still want brown black beer. So,
and that was also, once they saw that there was more sugars, all of a sudden you had a problem because they could use less of the barley for a more cost-effective method, but all of a sudden you started losing that color that the all-brown malt gave you.
Yeah. Then there was that period where people are putting, all kinds of caramels and crazy
Right.
ingredients in it, which at
Yeah.
the time was illegal, but they had to do anything to make it still look like porter.
And this is one of the things that sort of catapulted Guinness to the forefront. Is Guinness, when they were still making more beers than just stout, but it became known for one of the breweries who made reliably safe beer, right? Because historically, a lot of beer had been reliably a safe substitute for water in areas where drinking water wasn't readily accessible. So we're talking about 1 to 2.5%, 3% beers. Again, think of those miners having lunch. But as the beers got stronger and darker, right, you could start hiding things in the beer to make the beer cheaper, to make the beer blacker, all of these things. And so a lot of these stouts became physically dangerous, right?
Because you couldn't see what was inside.
Because you
of
couldn't
them.
see, what was inside of them.
Right.
And because there were cheap ways of making it dark that meant ingesting things like lead and
Yeah.
other sort of heavy metals and toxic
Well, we're happy
elements.
for Black Patent Malt that Black Patent Malt created the opportunity to make a darker beer without having to deal with any of those potential side effects of putting in less than ideal ingredients into your beer. So now, we're kind of blessed. We have a large variety of malt that we could use to make any style of beer we want. We have crystal malts from 20 to 120, which will give you varying grades of caramel color in your beer. We have chocolate malt, which won't be sort of as acrid and acidic as highly kiln malt like Black Patent Malt, but they'll give some of those chocolatey flavors and coffee notes to your beer. And so a lot of modern beers now kind of use these other, maybe they don't use as much Black Patent Malt as they used to traditionally, and they can rely on these lower roasted malts for a more balanced roast compound or roast flavor than was traditional with Guinness. Yeah, and it's interesting, too, when you think about the ABV of Guinness, right? Guinness is a 4.5% beer. And we talked about this before, but it'd be great to talk about kind of the sense that it was an imperial, stout was used to denote imperial, high strength. And
Right.
and now the
flagship dry Irish stout,
is 4.5% alcohol. How does that happen?
Yeah, so again, it starts in this like stout designation that's sort of imperial, and it's the original Guinness was probably more like 7.5%, and partly that was what was popular, but partly was to compete with other alcoholic crazes that were going on in the UK at the time, like gin, that was sort of sweeping not only the kind of upper classes of society who wanted to be seen drinking something different, but also was making its way into the porter and stout establishments of the world, and so you had that as well. And then it was a preservative, and it was generally considered to be healthier, right? If the beer stayed good longer, the alcohol had these restorative properties. Because we're also, we're talking about kind of the early era of like cure-alls, right? And so stout became one of those, Mr. Elon's cure tuberculosis.
Right. You remember the old signs, Guinness is good for you,
Guinness
with the
makes you
toucan on it,
Yeah.
Guinness makes you stronger. There was a campaign for getting pregnant women to drink milk stout as a way to help your pregnancy.
Help lactation.
And help
with
lactation with breastfeeding. So it's really interesting to think about an alcoholic beverage as kind of also this cure-all type of spun beverage at the same time. Now, generally, that's frowned upon in the medical community.
Well, think about just like we were talking about the hydrometer. They couldn't figure out how to measure sugar. So certainly your water source wasn't safe. We're talking about a pretty high level of sophistication in science just to be able to treat water for public water use.
Right.
If you can't float something in water to determine how much more dense it is than water, you're probably not going to be able to figure out how to keep bacteria out of it.
Right.
Or know what bacteria is. So beer did kind of make you stronger. It wasn't just like a myth. It was like a reality people were living. They were drinking water and getting the plague. They were drinking beer and feeling pretty damn good.
Yeah.
So
different time, I suppose, with different problems than we have today. So that's important.
Yeah, some of the first successful British colonies in what became America were successful because they were able to produce beer and didn't have to rely on the local
source.
water source.
Well, and it's the same thing is how did they get across the seas? What were they drinking on
Right.
board? And it was barrels of beer that was, you know, obviously palatable for long periods of time that allowed them to go on a good long journey.
Well, I feel like we probably all heard the myth, whether or not it's true, but they're like, oh, there's Plymouth Rock. We don't really want to land there, but
We ran out of beer.
we ran out of beer. So Plymouth Rock it is.
Yeah, good a spot as any, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you seen Plymouth Rock? It's very disappointing.
Really?
I'll be honest with you. They don't even know which rock it is. It's like a pit of like pebbles, and you're like, Plymouth Rock. You expect it to be this huge rock, and it's not a huge rock. It's just a sad
Is there a
pit.
brewery close by?
I don't. I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's a brewery close by. There's breweries popping up all over Massachusetts now.
Yeah. But so, so Guinness basically creates the first stout. It becomes the flagship stout. And all they do is they take their extra stout porter and they drop the word porter from it.
Right.
And it just becomes extra stout.
And this is in the 1800s, right? When this kind of happens.
Yeah, so this is about 3 or 4 years after the invention of black patent malt.
Right.
And so Guinness sort of takes on this style. And then it gradually becomes lower in ABV mostly as like personal trends in alcohol consumption shift.
Yeah.
You had like cast strength. You know, I mean, I work with a lot of distillers, and
Right.
you know, they'll take something off of a barrel and be like, whoa, 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 and have to water it down because it's barrel strength at that time, so it's much higher than you would consume in a regular glass. So you had a lot of taverns that would get a higher ABV, add a little water to it, and that would be what they would serve to their patrons.
Yeah. I guess that's a good way to transport items too. If you have it in a more concentrated form that can be diluted to a larger volume later.
Right. Well, and then transporting the popularity of stout and the need to transport it long distances and to other places sort of led into some of that serving innovation that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, so let's talk about nitrogen, because nitrogen is what a lot of people know Guinness for. You kind of have that nitro pour. So on a technical level, nitrogen is an inert gas that's used to either dispense or nitrogenate instead of carbonation, nitrogenate the beer. And it has a different, it's less acidic than CO2, so it doesn't kind of like tingle as much when you drink it, and the bubbles are smaller, physically smaller than CO2, so it tastes kind of silkier, a little more rich and smooth compared to the larger CO2 bubbles. But nitrogen is super interesting because up until really the late 1950s, we were drinking beer out of wooden barrels. And when you stop and like, beer's been around since what, 5,000 BC?
At least 5,000 years, yeah.
And we're talking about 60 years ago is when we got the modern keg as we know it today. Before that, it was all cask, and it was all through beer engines or just from the residual pressure, like Jake was talking about earlier, coming out of the cask. And Guinness kind of developed this innovation team, and they hired a bunch of scientists and mathematicians to help innovate. You know, they kind of caught a good wave with the innovative malt style that they had, the black patent malt, and then they wanted to continue innovation. A lot of it was to be able to package their product and serve it, to the masses. And so Guinness hired this this mathematician, and his name was Michael Ash, and he was hired in 1951 to kind of spearhead some of these innovative ideas, and he helped develop the nitrogen system for serving beer. Basically worked with a keg manufacturer to design and create what we think of as the modern beer keg, and they were using nitrogen as an inert gas source to serve the beer. And that innovation really changed draft beer as we know it today. You can go to your bar and get kegs of beer because Guinness decided to kind of make this investment in innovation. And so I think nitrogen has a pretty cool part in the history of beer, in addition to just being a cool, different way to consume stout. And that's kind of why stouts are typically thought of as the beer that you would drink on nitro versus other styles. Not to say breweries aren't serving IPAs on nitro, maybe they are, but like the history is kind of the stout that was served on nitro originally.
Right, because, again, those smaller bubbles kind of smooth it out. And the other piece of this, I think, and I'd be curious to know what Jake knows about this, but the other piece of this is that I've heard is that, the nitrogenation, the serving Guinness on nitro, one of the reasons for that investment was because we needed to mimic cask beer in a pressurized draft system.
Yeah, so there's kind of a lot of factors at hand into, if Guinness was making all this money, and if you ever go visit them at St. James Gate, it is incredible. You go through their museum, their level of like global dominance. You think about Guinness, you're like, how big could they be? It's so far in the past. I mean, this was like the, Microsoft or something of beer. Yeah. And this, like they had their own, huge tankards transporting boatloads of their beer to Asia. Like they didn't hire someone else to do it. They just made their own boats and did it. They just had a ridiculous amount of cash. But so, why would they have all this investment? Well, as we discussed earlier with the tomfoolery around the blending of the cask beers, that's like right at home in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, and you still got some people that are messing it up, then wanting to recover their beer. Well, if you're shipping your beer to totally different cultures and then trying to teach them how to, buy a beer engine and cask condition it, the odds your beer tastes good and you convert people who don't normally drink stout into falling in love with your product is very limited. So they had a large vested interest in figuring this out. So only correction, they had invented stainless, or it wasn't stainless, but
aluminum
metal casks. I don't remember what metal. It wasn't stainless, but they did. The metal firkin existed. I couldn't tell you when, but I know that wasn't 1960.
Right. Still kind of served with the natural carbonation versus industrial gases.
Totally,
same
the
firkin
process
that we think of today that a lot of brewers are bringing back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so they needed to mimic this cask taste, and my one little nerdy tidbit will be that fermentation, when it produces CO2, long as it is in high Kreuzen, in which case it produces a pH drop for different reasons, but carbonic acid lowers the pH. You discussed the tingling. But in small fermentations, like in bottle conditioning or cask conditioning, the metabolites of that small fermentation, even though carbonic acid lowers the pH, there's other metabolites that basically negate that
kind of
pH
buffer
swing.
against the pH change.
Exactly. So cask conditioned beer effectively didn't have carbonic bite. And so nitrogen played a perfect role to also not have a drop in that tingling feeling on your tongue. And so, that's basically why Guinness used it, as well as, as we've seen, college kids drunk can tap a keg in the modern form. Like, it isn't that hard to teach some people how to build a draft system. Like, building it and balancing it is actually quite an art. But after that part's set up, tapping the next keg and pouring it and just not changing the CO2 regulator is pretty minimum science. So it made a pretty foolproof way to send beer all over the world, almost have to teach in very little to nothing, and have your beer in the history of the world much better quality than it had ever been in.
And you get a consistent product that isn't reliant on the skill level of the person who's pouring it, right?
Yeah, you had to have a publican with incredible skill set previously, and that's why still in England today, where cask beer is still, not the dominant serving force, but certainly, as what am I looking for there? Camera would say is still the, national drink of England. But it's pretty traditional. You might go to one Fuller's bar instead of another right across the street because the publican serves it better here. And it's the same beer. And that's something we don't have in American our culture. You never think, oh, I'm going to go get Spice Trade's beer, but I'm only willing to drink it at Falling Rock and the place across the street or wherever, not actually meaning to call out anybody, isn't pouring it as well. So I won't, their beer tastes like trash there, but Falling Rock is perfect,
Yeah, and I think that goes for any product that really does a good job of expanding, whether it's a food product or any other service-based product, is to make it as foolproof as possible. If you're going to be a global domination force like Guinness was at the time, they needed, like you said, to be able to make that foolproof and not to rely on the skill level of local people to make sure their product was perfect. So it's great to see kind of a brewery of that size investing in innovation and kind of changing the direction of the industry as it is. And a lot, there's a lot of things that play into it too. Like a lot of things have to happen for nitrogen to come into beer. We have to find a way to separate and compress gases on an industrial level. None of this works unless you can get canisters of compressed gas to dispense beer, especially with nitrogen. As you know, nitrogen's a lot harder to get in solution in beer because it's not as soluble as CO2. So you have to have a massively higher pressure, like a little over 2 times as much pressure to even get the nitrogen in solution in the beer.
That's the need for something like a stainless steel keg.
Right, to be able to hold that pressure in and not explode. If you were to try to nitrogenate a wooden cask, you might not be able to tell anyone else about what you did because you might have died in a shrapnel-fueled cask explosion.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the other thing that's cool about nitrogen, I mean, one of the things you think about stouts and on Guinness on nitrogen or whatever, is it has that, just amazingly creamy, long-lasting head on it. And part of that is some of the ingredients in the malt that go into the glass. I think, Jake, we were talking earlier about flaked barley and stouts and giving it this great head. And also, like the nitrogen, because of the composition of gases in the atmosphere, there being so much more nitrogen, right? The nitrogen will sit on top of that stout or the top of that nitrogenated beer for a really long time, as opposed to CO2, because there's much less of that in the atmosphere. It will leave the glass very quickly.
Right. So a little bit more protection.
So it's a little more.
Hopefully you're drinking your beer in a short enough time period where it doesn't oxidize in the 5 minutes that you're drinking it, but also still a good point.
12 beers in a row.
And for whatever reason, and I don't understand the molecular level enough, but it is true that natural carbonation, CO2 created through fermentation, can produce smaller molecules of CO2 that can attain. So that's another reason nitro is like this perfect fit, because cask conditioned beer also has a head that roughly resembles nitro beer. Like they have that same creamy, grab the glass kind of look to it.
Yeah.
But
I wish I understood why that was the case, because it's the same reason why a bottle conditioned Belgian beer is going to have a tighter head on it and tighter CO2 than something that's force carbed with industrial gas. And Charlie would be a good guy to talk to about that. I'm sure he understands the metabolism size of gases in yeast, but it is an interesting point to kind of mimic that of the cask conditioned beer.
It's difficult because those carb stones, when you get to the ceramic, really high end ones, they charge you a fortune to get that micron level down to try to get the tightest bubbles you can.
Right. It's something that you look at with your eyes and you're like, this is a solid object.
Yeah.
But when you pump gas through it, gas flows through it.
I mean, even the cheap ones look like a solid, I mean, then you get into those, it can be like the most expensive thing in a craft brewery.
Right.
It's like the ceramic
carb stones.
Yeah.
Those tiny, 1-2 micron. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, it's probably time to remind everyone that they're listening to Beercraft.
Yes, they
Colorado's craft beer show.
Yeah, we're here. We're talking about beer. We're talking about stouts. Our topic this month is stouts. We're going to have a lot of different topics, but we have 2 shows going on today. And right now we're talking about the history from the beginning of the world to modern day in the framework of stouts.
We spent a lot of time talking about dry Irish stouts, which are sort of the traditional stouts, the Guinness stout. It's, sort of the BJCP exemplar of stout, right? But there's a lot of other different kinds of stout. We mentioned milk stout, right, in reference to its campaign being good for pregnant women, right? Another one that often got caught up in that health movement is oatmeal stout, because oats are good for you. So oatmeal stout became good for curing all kinds of diseases. So when we have records of oatmeal stouts being brewed in England, even though they may have contained less than 1% oats, they're called things like invalid beer and tuberculosis beer. And
hopefully because it cures tuberculosis and not because it gives you tuberculosis.
Right. But these were actual names of oatmeal stouts. And this is now why we have a Food and Drug Administration.
Yeah, the FDA. Yep.
But
yeah, it's interesting. There were a lot of styles came out of ingredients that were available. Lactose. A lot of people ask, "Oh, is there milk in this milk stout?" And you have to explain, no, there's not milk, but there's milk sugar. And that's another way to kind of mimic that creamy mouthfeel that nitrogen and cask ales produce, is by putting milk sugar in it, lactose, because lactose is non-fermentable by yeast, so that sugar remains in the final product once the beer is done fermenting, and provides a similar mouthfeel to a nitrogenated or to a cask-conditioned beer. And similar with oats, right? Oats kind of do the same too, a little richer, a little smoother, creamier.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of styles now of stout. There's American stouts, there's imperial stouts. There's, I think in the next hour here on our second show, we're going to really dive into technical brewing of stouts. But there's some new styles of stouts that are starting to take off too. Pastry stouts is something that is becoming wildly popular, utilizing dessert spices or ingredients, whether it's chocolate or cinnamon or whatever, in stouts. And then there's white stouts, which are kind of this mind bender stout where it tastes like a stout, the chocolate, the roasty flavors, the coffee flavors, but it looks like a blonde ale.
Yeah.
And those are all kind of modern, and maybe they'll catch on, maybe there'll be more fads. It's hard to tell because there's a lot of innovation happening in the beer world, what's going to stick and what's not going to stick.
Well, yeah, and then my favorite style of stout, which is Russian Imperial Stout.
Yeah.
Which is another sort of came about through historical competition. So Russian Imperial Stout became hugely popular in the court of Catherine the Great in the early 19th century in St. Petersburg, Russia. And a lot of the czars of Russia were in stiff competition to sort of out-European the Europeans. Right? So it was always like, oh, the Louvre has 215,000 works of art. Well, we have 215,004 works of art. And it was like this one-upsmanship. And when stout, you started having foreign export stout, which is the bigger, hoppier version of stout made for export, get to St. Petersburg, right? Their stouts had to be bigger, darker, roastier, higher ABV than the European ones, basically out-stouting.
And it was going to Russia, so they needed a little more
and it's really cold there.
Alcohol to stay warm.
So you get these like nice, sipping beers.
Right.
If someone could fact check it, I don't know the exact date, but I know it's it's recent history that beer was not considered an alcoholic beverage in Russia until I'm not kidding, it's worth pulling up, but within the last 30 or 40 years or something. It's totally absurd.
Yeah.
When whatever the number is, when you hear it, it's obviously not good enough that I remember the exact date, but it's good enough that I said it out loud.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm going to dig into that and find out a date for us because this is pretty interesting to me. Maybe 2011?
Oh, really?
Russia,
wow.
Hold on, let's see. Russia Classic. Yeah, July 21st, 2011.
Oh, man, I was saying 30 years.
He's officially signed a
8
bill
years ago.
that classifies beer as alcoholic in 2011. That's kind of wild. What have they been doing over there?
Drinking vodka.
Vodka means water in Russian, right? Is that true? I don't know.
We can have hire a fact checker.
Yeah, we need to hire a fact checker. Yeah.
Yeah, get CNN on it.
Jake Tapp. We need Jake Tapper.
Yeah, Jake the fact checker. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. I'd be curious to kind of talk about stout as it sits in the beer market today in the U.S. Right? There's a lot of brewers making stouts. We all brought one. You brought your Imperial Stout, which I'm really looking forward to trying a little bit later. I think you brought the Turkish
Turkish coffee stout.
Awesome. And I brought the chai milk stout. And Dan didn't bring a stout with him.
I'm just here to consume this.
You can be the guy that brings the Guinness. You're the Guinness guy.
Sure.
But as just kind of a snapshot of how stout fits into the market, so in the United States, 79% of the beer market is lager. The whole beer market, almost 80% is just a clean lager, whether it's a Pilsner or whatever kind of lager it is. It's very clean, easy drinking, 80%. 21% of that is everything else. Every other beer style that we consume is made up of that small chunk. And then craft beer, small, independent, non-owned by a larger conglomerate is about 13% of the market, that roughly. Getting closer to 20, but I don't quite know how close we are to 20%. But so stout in 2018 made up a total of 1% of the U.S. beer market, which is not a lot. in the grand scheme of things, but it's up 4% from last year. So kind of stout as a style and in the general population is on the rise. And 1% of the beer market ends up being a lot. It ends up being 13.8 million six-packs, which if you stack them end to end is enough to get from the Mexican border to the Canadian border, all the way down the line. You could drink your way from Mexico all the way to Canada in stouts
Is
in a year.
that volumetrically or by dollars?
That's volumetric sales, not dollar sales, yeah. Dollar sales might be different because, yeah, but these are all kind of volume sales. So, and just for reference, IPA makes up about 6% of the overall beer market compared to the 1% that stout makes up. And it rose 10% last year versus the 4% increase in stout. So IPA is definitely the hottest beer style if you take a snapshot of the United States.
Yeah.
So it's 1/10 of the IPA market right now.
We just need to bring the term stout back for strong beers.
Versus Imperial, get rid of
Yeah.
Imperial. Just
That'll
call
shoot
it.
the numbers way up.
Yeah, that would confuse and anger. I could see some angry Let's Talk Craft Beer posts about that if we decide to do that.
People trying out their stout.
Yeah,
Stout, extra stout.
stout squareds.
Yeah. Squared stout. Yeah.
Squared stout. I like that one.
That one's
Yeah.
all you.
No, all right. Cool. Well, I think that's a lot of what we had to talk about. We had kind of a good snapshot of the history of stout and kind of where we sit today. I'm excited to dig into the next hour of our show, which is really going to get into in the weeds about technical brewing. We talked about malting. We talked a little bit about brewing science and cask conditioned beers. But we're gonna sit down. We're gonna taste through some really cool stouts and talk about them. Talk about the flavors. Talk about the design intent with the beer, and just see what's going on with everyone and what they're working on.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank Dan and Jake for coming on for our very first Beer Craft, Colorado's Craft Beer Show.
Yep. Show. Yeah, it's great. It's a stout style show. It's going to be a great show coming up in the next hour, and we have a lot of cool topics coming up for other shows. And thanks for spending your time with us. Thanks for lending your insight, and appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Cool.
All right, we'll see you soon.